Welcome to Signal's continuous identity sessions, where we connect the brightest minds in identity with the strategies and real-world approaches that make IAM work better. I'm still your host, episode 5 now, and I'm back from a busy few weeks of industry events, Dustin Avall. Each session, we sit down with the people building and managing identity at enterprise scale. Those who've figured out how to eliminate bottlenecks, reduce manual work, and implement automation that actually improves security without slowing down the business. These people are doing really cool and interesting stuff. Today, we're taking the pulse of enterprise IAM. What's really working, what isn't, and where the industry is heading. If you've ever wondered whether that shiny new identity technology actually delivers on its promises or felt overwhelmed by all the continuous this and zero trust that flooding your inbox, you're going to love this conversation. We're joined by two people who probably have had more conversations with enterprise identity practitioners than just about anyone, and identity podcast royalty. Jim McDonald and Jeff Steadman from RSM. Not only do they lead RSM's IAM consulting practice, working directly with Fortune 500 identity programs, but you may also know them as the hosts of the Identity at the Center podcast, where they've conducted over 350 episodes interviewing everyone from vendor executives to practitioners in the trenches. Jim and Jeff, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
That was a great intro. Yeah, thanks.
It was too great, Jeff. Let's admit it. I mean, other than the fact that we talked to a lot of people in the space, that part was spot on. I mean, some of the other might have been exaggerated, but thank you, Dustin. Really appreciate it.
Well, yeah, cool. Like I said, the podcast royalty part and the most popular, I think, podcast, at least for what I see, we've had already some crossover guests. So maybe not in this hour, but maybe in the next one, I'll have to pick your brains about that. But to your roles at RSM, Jeff, maybe you can start first. Give me a quick sense of how the podcast fits into your work with the consulting as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think a lot of people think that Jim and I do the podcast full time as our jobs, and that could not be further from the truth. It generates bills, and so our day job for RSM is, anything to do with identity and access management. I think, it's strategy, it's assessments, it could be implementations of products, right? Things like that. But it's mostly just being a digital identity consultant and kind of helping people solve problems, whether it's people, process, or technology. That's the day job. And then everything else is kind of podcast around it. And so there's no formal linkage, I would say, between the two, but RSM has been very supportive of what we do. And, it's certainly been a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah, between the consulting engagements and hosting over, is it 350? What's the number at now?
Yeah, 379 goes live, Monday. And I've got 380 sort of waiting in the wings. We'll figure out what that looks like. But yeah, we're at around 379 through 780.
Jim, we just mentioned it. You talk probably to more practitioners and executives in identity than most people talk to just humans in general. What's that like? I mean, what's it like to be just on the forefront of those conversations?
Well, the first thing is just the level of appreciation for people to come on the show. I think a lot of folks, they start with the standpoint of like, hey, almost like an imposter syndrome. Like, am I the right person to be talking about this? And we get those folks on the show, and 99 times out of 100, they're completely comfortable because we're talking about things that we do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, at the core, Jeff and I are identity practitioners. We started in the industry at the lowest levels, worked our way up, became program managers, and then entered the scary world of consulting, where you never know what the next pitch is going to be. It could be a curveball, it could be a fastball, and you just have to adjust. Over time, you get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And, I think the podcast is kind of the same way. It was like Jeff hit me up over 6 years ago and said, hey, I had an idea. Why don't we do a podcast? And I was like, I don't know anything about that, but sure. And we started doing the podcast. We've released an episode every Monday for over 6 years. We have over 1 million downloads. That was a milestone we hit this year. And, there's no turning back at this point. Like, I don't even see the end of the tunnel for this thing. I mean, we're just going to keep doing it, right, Jeff?
Yeah, you keep coming up with all these ideas like, what about we do this? I'm like, dude, we have no time. We better get this one done.
Started from the bottom, now we're here. I mean, from the mailroom to the suite, I guess.
I was a bus boy and a server and a bartender before I even got into IT. So yeah, like literally, very, very, very beginnings of it.
And Dustin dropped the Drake reference, so good for him.
Early on. Jeff, I'm not sure about the busing and the bartending, but from the consulting and the podcast interviewing, how does one help inform the other? Are there things that you see on the consulting side, that you then bring into the podcast or vice versa?
Oh, for sure. I think this is really sort of the genesis of how we started. It was like, we're having really good conversations with clients, and it's like, okay, nobody else, 6 years ago was doing an IAM podcast. And so a lot of the conversations that you hear on our show are informed by, shaped by, influenced by conversations we're actually having with not only clients, but people in the industry that we might see at conferences, for example. So Dustin saw a couple weeks ago, right, at the SailPoint conference, for example, right? So those types of conversations that are happening in the hallways and, in boardrooms and in conference rooms, where people are doing real IAM work, all that stuff, influences, because we want to put out a show and have episodes that actually make sense for people, in the real world, because I can say, hey, this podcast now is 100% more zero trust and 200% more AI, and that doesn't mean anything, right? We try to focus on specific topics like, hey, this is what people are actually talking about, or here's where things need to be moving towards. And so how do we start to shape the conversation and say, hey, here's how you sell IAM internally, or yeah, it's great. Zero trust is awesome, but to get there, you need these other steps. So let's focus on those other little steps, right? Those sorts of things.
Starting broadly, and maybe this is a question that I'll give to both of you. We'll zero in, I'm sure, as we go on today. But what's your current vantage point on the state of the industry? How if you had to just give a broad sort of brush stroke, what are you thinking?
I'm assuming Jim and I will have varying opinions on this, and we are very different people. So I'll go first as the brave one here. I will say I think there is a little bit of a divide in the haves and the have-nots. So people who have technology for whatever reason, and they have invested in it over the years, and they have tools that are helping their IAM program. And then you have the have-nots that have not done that. They are relying on people and process and probably heroism as a strategy to run IAM, which isn't sustainable. At some point, those smaller organizations, or those, I would say, those less mature organizations that don't have the technology, start to think about, when do I make an investment to buy an IGA tool or a PAM product, or, et cetera. So I think there is a little bit of a divide there where we go to these conferences and it's like, yeah, let's do all this crazy cool stuff. The assumption is that people have solved this. And I think there's a lot of companies that have not even really tackled the basics of an IAM program.
Jeff, this might surprise you, but basically I was going to give the same answer. I think there's the haves and the have-nots, or, kind of to make an analogy would be wealth disparity. You got billionaires and you have, average or below average earners. And I think the majority, there's more people or more organizations in that are just above the cybersecurity poverty line, if you will. I do think it's really cool to focus on that exciting stuff, but there's so often that Jeff and I are brought into an organization. I would say that, Jeff and I have been doing identity advisory. So helping organizations kind of come up with a roadmap. Usually they call in consultants, not when things are going perfectly, right? It's when they're way behind or underinvested in identity. And they're like, oh, so there's this thing called IGA or privileged access management. Now, what I will say is just that poverty line has existed for as long as we've been alive. People even at the poverty line have iPhones. And I think that's what I'm seeing a lot today, is that most organizations either have Microsoft or Google, and so they have some identity management tools that they're using. They have some single sign-on, some semblance of basic identity management, which you didn't see 10 years ago. You could literally go to organizations 10 years ago, zero single sign-on, and just pushing paper around. So I think kind of the rising tide of the technology world. I'm just dropping every little quote I can. The rising tide, if you will, has kind of lifted everybody, and I think most people have basic capabilities now. And what's really exciting, though, is when you have an organization that is saying, "All right, we've got a lot of the basics knocked off. We have." Our provisioning processes in place. We have single sign-on. We have privilege access management nailed down. We're in a good place as far as our customer identities. Now, how can we kind of enter this world of identity security? That's exciting stuff. And, once in a while, I think we get to play in that backyard. What's really great is that from a podcast perspective, we talk to those folks all the time, but we're also seeing some clients kind of enter that realm as well. And, there's like convergence of a lot of things happening. I guess we're going to talk about all those things.
I think there's also like forcing functions, though, that happen every once in a while, right? The pandemic from 5 years ago forced a lot of organizations to invest in MFA. We've been saying MFA is needed for a decade, if not longer. And it was all of a sudden, oh my gosh, you've got to get everybody to work from home. How can we do that securely? And so there was like a huge amount of, organizations that hadn't even tackled MFA 5 years ago over the next, year or two as they started to migrate to more remote hybrid workforces. You have like this, world event that kind of pushes things forward. And it's unfortunately, that's how a lot of things get done sometimes. It's a pandemic. We got breached and now we have to spend a bunch of money to catch up and do like the basics that we should have been doing all along, like that kind of thing.
So if the haves, if we can use those terminology, are really like in the enterprise, right? They're enterprise identity teams, they're mature, they've got MFA, they've got single sign-on, IDPs. What are they struggling with that they can't solve internally? What are the most common problems that you're seeing enterprise identity teams bring to you right now, Jim?
I'll tell you, like the biggest problem that most organizations run into is internal organizational dynamics, AKA politics. So they're, they know what to do, right? I always say with internal identity, it's usually like the playbook is there. You don't have to get that creative. On the customer side, maybe. And there's even more organizational dynamics or politics on the customer side, but let's focus on that internal enterprise side for a second. It's getting people to buy into the vision, to support the vision, to not go and kind of subvert it by coming up with their own solution, solving things at the enterprise level, making a common investment, looking at something like what your company does with bringing everyone together to a common good of using shared signals. I mean, to me, that's it. The reason why we're here on this podcast, I think, is that is kind of one of the driving forces. Like that's the way things are going in the future. But who's really important? It's the identity practitioner or the identity program manager. We've always said someone's got to be the person who reaches across the aisle to find to build consensus. And that's the background that both Jeff and I come from, which I think is what makes is a good breeding ground for being a consultant. It's like you've actually done it in an organization where you've had to deal with people who have competing interests at heart, maybe, but still drive everyone toward the good of the organization and, rolling out solutions that help.
Yeah. It's interesting. Jeff, how do you help reconcile the conversations that you have with vendors, either on the consulting side or on the podcast, with the reality you're seeing from the practitioners who maybe can hear some promises from, could be those vendors or others, and what's actually working in the production environment? You kind of have to have an interesting balance there, I suppose.
Yeah, really need to be realistic with what your product can do. I get it. Everybody's trying to make sales and, marketing, and every vendor, to some degree does this, but a lot of times you end up with this overzealous, salesperson, sales engineer, whatever it might be, right? Whatever they get called to say, oh, our product is the best thing. It will slice all your bread and it will, do your dishes and your laundry. And then it hits the real world. And that's when I see a lot of problems. Politics was my number one answer. My number two answer for where people struggle with is reconciling what the product they bought does with what they think it can do. And so there's this disconnect with, well, I bought, product A and I was told it would solve these problems, when in actuality, it really only solves one or two. Or maybe it can solve all of them, but you've got to match your business process and your people and your organization to the business process of the product that you brought. So I think that's kind of like the disconnect that I typically see is, again, it's overzealous probably. It's, maybe a little bit of people looking for a silver bullet. I do think that the consumers in the IAM space, meaning the IAM practitioners, have gotten a lot smarter around what tools can and can't do, because now there's a whole bunch of people who have experience doing this type of stuff. Whereas, IGA might have been, a luxury item 20 years ago. Now it's a commodity item. There are hundreds of IGA products. Same thing for privileged access management. Same thing for access management when you think about things like MFA. And so vendors are dealing with a much smarter and much more well-educated IAM individual on the whole. And so they really need to be smart about how they position their product, their skill set, their tools to be able to solve the problems, and be realistic about what they can and can't do.
Yeah, well put. Jim, we heard a couple of categories there. I'll call them industry categories: PAM, IGA, access management, without necessarily mentioning vendors. How are you seeing these product groups performing in this? Are they living up to kind of what was promised? Is the IAM teams at these organizations being required to do more than what the products are delivering, or what's the general feeling that you get there?
Yeah, I think the privileged access management space is probably the toughest one, or what is, I should say, is facing the most challenges by the cloud world, because they were kind of built for the on-premise or the data center that you control, and not all the infrastructure automation and kind of the scope of privileged access management has expanded so quickly. There have been a lot of startups, so the incumbents are probably struggling the most in that area of any of the areas. I feel like access management is, in terms of single sign-on, things like that, that stayed the most stable. And IGA, I think IGA is the right technology for the time, but you have the how you implement the IGA is very important. Making sure that you don't exhaust your users with, hey, we've got another access recertification to do. Because I'll tell you what, in most organizations, it's a handful of people that do all those access recertifications. They're not just hired to do access recertifications either, right? They're usually the key cogs in the organization, and they're stuck there having to spend a ton of time working in your identity and access management tools. So, those are some of the challenges that are happening. I think everybody's looking at AI on the horizon. Obviously, AI is the biggest trend, and the question is not only IAM for AI, it's not only AI for IAM, it's both, right? How's it going to change the IAM products? And then how are we going to manage identity and access within AI agents, for example? And so that's going to be the big challenge that all of us have to answer, that we've all got to figure out as an industry. And then as an industry, we have to be successful that, the AI agents don't wind up showing all over the enterprise before our industry really has the answer.
Yeah.
And I don't want to open up the flood of hey, I get 500 LinkedIn messages hey, my company with, that just started up 4 months ago, we've got the answer. I don't it's not like that, right? It's going to be an industry answer. It's going to be that people get the problem.
Well, being a technology identity security content platform here, we're contractually obligated to talk about AI, right? And surprised it took us this long, but Jeff, let's kind of dive in there a little bit further. It's everywhere in identity vendor messaging. Like you said, we saw each other at the SailPoint event a couple of weeks ago, and there were plenty of booths that were, highlighting what they did around AI. And from your conversations with customers in those practitioners or maybe even executives, where are you seeing AI actually add value versus just being that marketing fluff?
Yeah, the value part is still questionable. I think people right now, realistically, are more using it for internal business process, writing policies, writing procedures, like things like that. I think there is obviously a need and a desire to grow beyond that. But I think there's a lot of organizations that are very tepid about moving data into a platform that they don't control. And so, there are certainly some opportunities out there for, private LLMs and things like that, where, Microsoft has capabilities in the space. I'm sure, you can probably do something similar with like OpenAI and Anthropic and others, and Google, for the kind of the big three. But I think there is still a skepticism where, yeah, that's cool, but how do I know I can trust it? Like, how do I know that the AI is doing what it's supposed to be doing, and then it's not flagging things incorrectly, right? Or, making decisions that aren't the playbook that have been assigned to it. So I think there's this layer of audibility and transparency and visibility, and that needs to be part of the discussion, to not just say, hey, our product has these, 200% more AI, show me how it's making the decision. Have your AI decisions be explainable. And I think you're actually seeing this in some of the consumer versions, right, of AI, is it will now show you the steps that it's taking. And so I think this is it's such a fast moving space. I'm sure what I just said just became out of date like 30 seconds ago.
Yeah.
So, it's constantly evolving. I think there's great value in it. I do. I'm a very big fan of AI, but it's like any other tool. It's going to be used for good and it's going to be used for bad. And so at some point, we're going to end up like the Matrix, and it's going to be like, AI versus AI, and then humans are stuck in the middle. Like, well, tell me what you guys decide.
Jim, are there other pragmatic applications of AI and identity you're seeing organizations successfully deploy? I mean, where do they even get started?
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up with just real quickly of something that Jeff said, which is about this traceability and how the decisions are made. I mean, I think as consultants within a public accounting firm, we think about this a lot, right? Because it comes back to controls. It comes back to how do you manage IAM if it was just a paper and pencil process? The thing is that the scale is too large to have it be a paper and pencil process. Things don't operate at paper and pencil speed anymore. But ultimately, it's got to come back that you can explain, like, Dustin approved this access, and we have a paper trail of that. And so that's one of the biggest things that AI has got to prove. I think, where I see it working a lot now is, AI for IAM. So again, two types, AI for IAM and IAM for AI. I think that we're doing a good job in trying to solve that AI for IAM, or at least we're starting to see features roll out in terms of, analytics and insights, and maybe some recommendations for how to provision access or what access a person should get. I think where it's going to head is that, people will start to build more trust and let AI actually take action. Hey, a user's looking funny, let's disable them, or let's have them be able to recertify access. So kind of going back to those paper and pencil processes for sure, but also using AI to actually be able to make decisions. I think IAM for AI is really, it's got to flesh out, like, how is AI going to be showing up in the organization? I think that when you're maybe rolling out AI from Microsoft in terms of Copilot, the thought is, well, if you've got your Azure Entra ID roles and entitlements set up, then that will take care of it. But what if you're using either on-prem AI or AI tools that are, that have their own layer, or you're using ChatGPT or something like that? Then what happens? How do you manage your AI security for those different platforms? And maybe that's, I said this on one of our recent podcasts, maybe that's a space for the future, which is, the multi-AI IAM.
Yeah. Wow. Definitely an opportunity to innovate there. And what you're both talking about, Jeff, you mentioned in jest, but not too far off, that it could be changing right now. And what we've said is now kind of out of date, right? Because especially in AI, this is not a static world. It's constantly changing. And so, we talk about continuous identity. This is the continuous identity session. I'd like to say that continuous identity is really heating up and maybe even blowing up, but I'll ask you, from your conversations, Jeff, are customers talking about this? Are they defining it? Is it just vendor messaging, or is there real substance to being a continuous identity approach?
No, I think it's definitely where the industry is going and where organizations want to go, meaning continuous identity. I'm a fan of it. My good friend Sean is a big fan of it as well. And that is where the puck is going. But to get there, you need to have a very, very good handle on your data. For continuous identity work, you're talking about, millisecond based identity, not minute, hour, day based identity, right? Maybe even nanosecond at some point. You're talking about continuous identity, meaning this thing occurred, this data signal was received, and now I am orchestrating an action based off of some sort of playbook on what I want to have happen with that. You cannot do that without data. And so I think there's a lot of organizations that would like to be there. They're not ready for it, frankly. Like, they have not figured out their identity data within the organization. They have not figured out how to collect that all in one spot. They might be doing logs into a SIM or something like that, right? And doing some basic things. But I think if, continuous identity, I believe, is the future, and using things like shared signals framework and other things to help broker communications between products. But for any of that to work, you've got to have the identity data ready to go. And that's the next step. I think there is a big opportunity right now to help organizations figure out, okay, if this is where we need to be and we want to be, millisecond based identity, how do we make sure we've got the data that can support it?
It's a lot of data too, right?
Yeah. I mean, heaps and heaps, like at least 512 bytes.
Yeah, at least a megabyte, probably a megabyte.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is it's instantaneous. It's changing, right? It's context switching. It's all the different things you think about yourself. Even just in this conversation, right? You're putting on different hats. There's no difference from the identity that's being consumed. Where am I logging in from? Is the login device I'm using secure? Is it machine owned? Is it personally owned? Is it the right time of day? Is the thing that I'm trying to access, within my scope of my permissions? Is the transaction within the application that I'm trying to do, is that within the scope? That's all data. And I just don't think most organizations are ready for it. Only the largest and most well-funded have really started to figure out and start to skate towards that. But I do believe continuous identity is the future, but I think it's probably more of like a 3 to 7 year future for it to have really more of an adoption, just because the identity data is so hard to hurdle over.
If I could just follow up on that, Dustin.
Yeah, please.
So one thing that Jeff and I have talked about a lot. So last year we went to the European Identity and Cloud Conference. And so we got to meet a lot of our identity practitioner counterparts in Europe. And I think they have a different mindset than a lot of the US practitioners. And I think it's probably more at the executive level, where I'd say the US mindset is product based. Like, give me a product, give me one throat to choke. Whereas I think the European mindset is more around this identity fabric concept, which is that I take the parts and pieces and I build the overall solution that I need, which I'm more in favor of. I think the more sophisticated organizations in the US are already shifting to, but those at the poverty line are still like, give me a product and give me a product that I can afford. So this is, I love continuous identity. It's like, but is it going to turn into a product that people can implement? That's probably what it's going to take to go down market a little bit.
I don't think it's a product, though. I think it's a mind shift in how you approach it, but it's also just the maturation of organizations. This is very similar to like moving to the cloud, right? 20 years ago. I don't trust the cloud. I'm going to put my data in my own data centers. It's the same type of concept, because new organizations, that, especially ones that are born now, probably don't even have an on-premise footprint. They don't have a local Active Directory. They don't have legacy applications. They're already operating in a world where they do have APIs to the data that they need. They just maybe haven't glued it all together. It does take time for that shift to happen, decades, right? So I think, when I say 3 to 7 years, I think it's those organizations that have been migrating to the cloud over the last couple of decades. I mean, there are still people who are on-prem and they're still migrating, to whatever their cloud solution looks like. With that comes the ability to leverage more of that data and the accessibility and all the different capabilities that those cloud platforms provide from an API and a data perspective.
And not speaking in too many absolutes, but I'm pretty certain that just about every customer we talk to has some legacy application still living in a on-prem or maybe even worse mainframe type of environment that they're hoping to incorporate into this approach and wondering how to connect it. And I imagine those are some of the opportunities you all are brought in as well.
Yeah, the mainframe. What does dead man never die? To quote Game of Thrones, it has been around forever. I feel like every major insurance organization and bank have like a secret server of like mainframes all running in their basements. And those are
somebody has a critical application running on a desktop under their desk.
Yeah. Using an open source, methodology that is supported by one person in the entire world. And if that thing goes away, right, everything goes to problems. But I mean, I think there's just so much that it is modernization of that infrastructure, right? I think there's really no impetus for an organization to fix what isn't broken. If the mainframe works and we're getting what we need, then an executive is going to look at it and say, well, why do I need to spend money? It's great. It's fine. Because generally I find that IT and especially IAM people are really good at hiding pain. They hide the pain and they're using other sorts of, heroism constructs to hide that pain to make it appear as if there are no issues.
We talked to Felix Gatkins, formerly of Gartner and one of the authors of the Identity First cybersecurity framework or approach, and he talks a lot about the 3 C's in addition to continuous, this contextual and consistent approach. And part of what I think we're touching on here is even mainframes can leverage and provide some important context. And you talked about it a little bit, Jeff, but there's different, signals that we call them that are coming in from different systems in order to make some of these more continuous real-time access decisions, both at the front door and also past the front door. You've talked about the shared signals framework pretty extensively on your podcast. Jim, are you seeing meaningful adoption in this? Is it still early days? What's holding organizations back from more event-driven approaches that's even more real-time?
No, I do see the adoption. I think it's going to take time. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think that even the advanced organizations are kind of like plugging some of the holes within their organization, but they're starting to invest in things like continuous, event-driven, and I think that it's just a matter of time. Certainly. So Jeff and I spend a lot of time going to conferences. That's where we meet a lot of the folks who follow the podcast and wind up being guests on the podcast. And so we get that they're like really interested and really plugged into what's happening in this identity security space. And so they're putting some of their chips there. They can't put all their chips there. I think Jeff also made a good point, right? They don't want to go back to their board and say, our identity is a freaking mess. Like, it's like, then what have you been doing here for the last 5 or 10 years? I guess you can't do that. You have to kind of like put your best foot forward. Like, we're doing a really good job.
Yeah.
It's the industry. This is one thing, this is one of the truths I live by, which is that identity follows the technology that's happening in the industry. Cloud. Cloud came about with or without an identity. Cloud was going to come about. Now identity has to figure out how to support cloud. So it's changes in the IT or the technology landscape. Well, what's the next big one? It's AI. And we're going to have to, as a industry, kind of figure out how are we going to hopefully not get caught behind the curve like we did with cloud. I really feel like as an industry, we got caught behind the curve. And when I talk about cloud, I'm not talking about software as a service as much. I'm talking more about, platform as a service, like managing or infrastructure as a service, Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure.
At the risk of being controversial, I'm going to say that AI identity is not a new thing. We have had service accounts forever. And so, this is not a new thing. These are not new problems to solve for from an identity perspective. The real problem to solve for is speed. How quickly can we spin up and down these activities, these identities? How quickly can we spin up and down authorizations to be able to do activities with these identities? That is
the authorizations is the hard part, right?
I mean, it's all hard. It's speed. How quickly can you do this?
It's speed. I think with the authorizations, though, doesn't it also come down to what can Jeff Steadman access? If Jeff Steadman goes into the an AI prompt and says, "Hey, I'd like to see Jim McDonald's paycheck," is it going to let you do it or not? If it has access to the data. Now, if you go in and you say, "Hey, I'd like to see Jeff Steadman's paycheck," well, you are Jeff Steadman, it should show it to you. I know that's like a simple Simon example, but it's all the things that you could potentially ask. And with AI, with an open prompt, I mean, it's endless, the types of questions that you could ask.
But those permissions are not new problems. The same thing can be said of a human doing it. So in that scenario, right, should I be able to see Jim's paycheck? No, unless I am a manager or HR or something like that. That is no different than if an AI is doing it versus me as a human trying to do that. That's a permission issue. I feel like the issue is speed. How quickly can you do those types of things?
And I would argue, can we add some more context to that? Not just the role or the department, but what else? Why else should be requesting that access?
And that's why the data.
Where's that enforcement going to happen, though, Dustin? Who's going now? You ask a question of a prompt. Hey, I would like to have the financial performance for this sector of my company.
Right.
And now you're asking the question, you've got some context, you've got some permissions. Who gets to decide if that combination of context and permissions actually gets the data or not? Or what part of the data you get and what part of the data you do not get? That's tough because it's unstructured data. And do you want to rely on your AI agent to make that decision, or at what level are we enforcing that?
So now we're back to trust. It's visibility. First of all, how is a decision being made? And I'll tell you right now, the business owns the decision of who can access their data. It should not be identity. It should not be security, blah, blah, blah. Those groups advise the business on what the appropriate risk is, but the business makes that decision. And then from there, it is, again, I feel it's a data and a speed issue. If you have the data, you should be able to make these policy-based decisions. We're already doing it today at a much smaller scale. So if you think about things like conditional access policies, I can only log in from X device in X location. That is a policy, and unless you fit that policy, you cannot do that thing. The same thing needs to apply to authorizations which is way more difficult because there is no standard for authorizations. Every single application does it differently. And so you think about, frameworks like Auth0 or Cedar or Open Policy Agent, right? Things like that, where there is sort of a, movement to try to have some sort of standard authorization model. Cool. Talk to me in 10 to 20 years when there's enough applications using it, because I doubt,
Right.
SAP is going to go back and rewrite the model for their T codes and how they manage, permissions within their system. It's going to take a while to get there, I think.
And know it or not, you guys are doing a great job of teasing some upcoming episodes of continuous identity sessions. So I appreciate that. Also, if we shift gears a little bit and try to give some advice to hopefully folks out there who are watching and listening in the identity practitioner realm who are wondering about this identity skills shortage that I keep hearing about. So from your experience, Jim, what skills are most in demand right now? Is it AI? If you're an identity professional, should you be learning AI, or where would you direct those folks?
Yeah, so this is a tough question, because if you asked me 2 years ago, my answer would have probably been more straightforward. And now I wonder, is AI going to replace us all? Is there going to be any need for anybody? Well, I think the answer is yes. And
hope so.
I hope so too. Sometimes people are like, well, we'll all be podcasting. It's like, no, AI can do that as well. There's actually potentially no need for us at all. But that's a doomsday scenario. I think it's all the above. I think people like Jeff and I who, kind of have that practitioner background, the ability to organize things, the ability to think about things strategically and build relationships, that's still going to be a valuable skill. I think from a technologist standpoint, you do see things evolving. I got into IT and I got really into being a network engineer. There are a lot fewer network engineers today, I think, than there were at least needed back then, because a lot of things got consolidated. Data centers got consolidated. I remember racking servers. How many people rack servers today? Back in the day, it was everybody. So I think AI engineer is a big one. I talk to my son all the time, who is a junior in a cybersecurity program, about, make sure you really understand how AI works. Put as much of your effort into that, and you will be needed. So, if I'm starting out, that's what I'm looking at. If I'm early in my career, especially if I'm a technologist, I'm looking at that. I think if I'm not a technologist, going the route of project management is a skill. And then if you have the personality for it, those things will take over, and you'll rise through the ranks from kind of management.
You mentioned identity program management earlier. Yeah, Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with Jim. I think, people need to figure out what they want to be when they grow up, and they may not know, and that's fine, right? But are you a technical person or a non-technical person? Because there is plenty of room in identity for both. There is the technical side, yes, engineer, implementer of tool, an architect, right, where you're, knee deep in specs and, helping get things connected. And then there's also the non-technical side, project management, product management, program management. The mayor of IAM town, right? Who's the person out there, shaking hands and kissing babies and making the relationships to say, hey, we've got this really great idea. We want to bring this to you. How do you build that trust with another part of the organization to do that? Sometimes you can get away with mandates. It's security policy, or we have to do it because of SOX or HIPAA or some other, regulation. But in the real world, you really need to have a relationship building, with the different parts of the business. So I think there's opportunities on either side from the soft skills. I think the biggest thing is to be a good communicator. Help translate whatever it is people are trying to say on the identity side into whatever the business needs to hear to get that support or that funding, right? Or that buy-in, or whatever you want to call it. Work on the communication side of things, because there's a lot of really smart people that just cannot articulate why you should be doing this really brilliant thing. And if you can do that, I think you're going to be a leg up on others.
Yeah, agreed. As we start to wrap up, I've got a few kind of final questions. Maybe I'll popcorn back and forth and start with you, Jeff. For organizations that are hearing all this terminology and concepts and identity, all sorts of buzzwords, What's your advice for kind of cutting through the noise and really focusing on what matters?
I think try to not get distracted with others and what you hear from vendors. Figure out from your own business, like what is important to you. So, that's cool. We want to solve, I'll pick on IGA. Like there's a lot of automation that can be done there. And then the vendor comes in and says, oh, but you could do all those things with AI. That's like a 5-year project if you're only just starting and working on automation, right? So I think understanding what are your use cases that you're trying to solve for and try to hone in on that as much as you can. I think get out there, talk with other people, attend conferences. If you are working for a company, you only know the way that you do it unless you talk with others. So if there are other organizations, I'll give a shout out to like idpro.org, right? There's this healthy Slack channel where you can ask all these questions and meet others. Go to conferences, open invite. If you see me or Jim, I'll throw him out there as well. At a conference, come up, say hello. Let us introduce you to other people that we know in the space that might be in similar spaces. I did a lot of that at the SailPoint conference, for example. It was like, hey, you should talk to my friends over here, right? And waking people up. You're not alone, and you don't have to figure it out alone.
Great advice. Jim, what developments or innovations in identity are flying under the radar right now you think could be bigger deal than people actually realize?
I don't want to sound like I'm taking the easy route here, but I kind of feel like we're still having conversations about AI and building out, or we're still having conversation where we're building applications and starting to build AI backends, but thinking about the front end of the application like a traditional web application. It's like, I think we really need to move forward and think about how AI actually works, how large language models work, and how you can just tell it what you want and get a result back. So I at least wanted to mention that because that's come up in my day-to-day a few times recently. I think Jeff and I are, because we're consultants, we kind of come from the world of pragmatism. And I think pragmatism can be especially helpful. But I think you also, and kind of, I think where Jeff was going when it came to kind of those solutions that we talk about, it's like, that's 5 years down the road. And I think that he and I are kind of wired to think that way because we're working with clients and kind of like helping them map out their journey. But I think we have to think about the things 5 years down the road because those 5 years come and go pretty quickly in this world. And I think I think listening to podcasts like this, podcasts like Identity at the Center, right? Exposing yourself to all those things is especially important if you're a practitioner, because one of the disadvantages we have as practitioners, like practitioners who are not consultants especially, is that you live in your world. And if you just live in your world and you don't expose yourself to things like decentralized identity or continuous identity, even things like KIM, cloud infrastructure, entitlement management, like know what's going on in the industry and whether or not those things apply to you or not, really just be aware that these things are happening. I think those, and I'm not going to put like my stamp of approval on any one given technology and say it's going to be the next thing, because I kind of, I did that with ITSM like 2 years ago, and like all of a sudden it's like falling off the radar. Like no one even wants to talk about it anymore. And I thought it was a fantastic technology that was kind of like right for the time. But I think what's important is like to have your, to survey the landscape, keep your mind open, attend conferences, listen to podcasts, go to webinars, things like that, and then solve the real world problems in your company.
I was going to ask, and I was going to put it to you, Jeff, if you had some advice for someone watching this session and only could do one thing next week, what you would tell them to focus on. But it sounds like you both have already answered that, and just kind of get out there and talk to people and understand more about what's going on in your industry and maybe beyond. Am I tracking that right?
Yeah. Travel the IAM world, right? Get out, talk to other people. It doesn't have to be extravagant. There's lots of local things, but go out and talk to other people. I hate to say it, but most organizations are not special when it comes to identity problems. They are problems that everybody faces. And the IAM community specifically is very good about helping each other out. It's not typically secret sauce, competitive things where people aren't willing to share. Yes, there are vendors in the space, so I'll exclude kind of that. But most real world identity people talk to each other and say, hey, this is how I solve this problem, or have you thought about this? Again, you're not alone. Travel, get out, get to conferences, talk to other people, listen and learn. I think you have to decide whether or not you are a identity professional, right? Is this a career or is this just a job? If it's a career, it's education, lifelong, right? You're always learning. Jim and I don't have all the answers. We've been doing this for 20 plus years each at this point. There is always something new, and that's what keeps it fresh. If you really want to be an identity professional, it is a career, and that means you need to treat it as such, not just a 9-to-5 job, and that's it.
We like to end our sessions on a question or two. We ask everyone, lucky enough to have this triple play today with the three of us. In the spirit of continually evolving, I'll start with you, Jeff. What's something that you continuously do? Given 389 podcasts, maybe it's you continuously podcast, but it could be a hobby, a skill, something personal. What's something that you think of, I'm going to continuously do that, endlessly almost?
Well, it started with the podcast, and it's been a great way to really learn and expand. I learn from our podcast just as much as probably anyone listening to it. I do all the editing, so I'm learning the editing. I think I've got the audio side down pretty well. Now I'm learning video editing now that we've kind of branched into YouTube and stuff like that. So for me, like personally, a skill set is how do I create a visually compelling message for these episodes? And then I take that to my daily job as well and say, hey, how do I turn these into, these strategies, these roadmaps, these, board decks we're presenting to a board and say, how do I craft a compelling message that gets buy-in? Same thing for conferences. We do a lot of game shows at conferences. That's become sort of our thing. And I'm having a really fun time with it. And I think our audience really likes it too, because it's like, hey, you may not learn anything, but I hope you'll be entertained. And so if you can get people laughing and into a room and have a good time with it, that's where the opportunity for dialogue comes from. And I think, that expands then your horizons, and you kind of, say, hey, wasn't that great? Or, oh boy, he sucks, right? And you can bond over whether you liked me or hate me, or Jim, or, vice versa.
Jim, same idea. It's something you continuously do.
Yeah, Jeff knows I always talk about the concept of sharpening the saw, which is really continuing education. I think it's so important. The way I like to educate myself, it's funny, like I do a podcast with Jeff. I love podcasts. I listen to, quote unquote, what you would think of as our competitors, not for competitive information, but because they're pretty good. Cooper and Cole has a podcast. There's the HIP podcast. I mean, I'm really interested in digging into this podcast as well. I don't think I'll be able to watch the episode that we appeared on. And I'm on YouTube, like trying to find identity videos. I will tell you this, I wish more organizations got out there and put their webinars and things like that on YouTube. A lot of times you go to research technology and it's like the last video was uploaded 6 years ago, and you can see they uploaded like 30 videos in 30 days and nothing since. And it's like, it's like you're missing an opportunity. I think sometimes people look at the stats and like, only 25 people watched the video. It's like, yeah, but one thing we've learned in doing the podcast is we started six and a half years ago, and literally we were getting like 20, 25 listens for the first 10 videos, or the first 10 episodes. Yeah. And we knew who they were, right?
Yeah, I was probably 20 of them testing.
Family members, yeah.
Yeah. We stay consistent. We put out an episode every Monday, and that's what I would recommend to organizations that are trying to kind of build their brand and raise their profile within the industry, is like, be consistent, continue to put out good content, product demos, things like that. People will find it. And that's how I keep my saw sharp, is like getting other people's opinions and information that they put out on the internet.
Amazing. Well, thank you for helping us to sharpen our saws. And thanks again, Jim McDonald and Jeff Steadman, co-hosts of the Identity at the Center podcast and consultants in IAM at RSM. And thanks to everyone who joined us today and who have been enjoying and sharing this series. Quick reminder, all these sessions are recorded and available at signal.ai. And Jim will be happy on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe at signal.ai, get details on all upcoming episodes. That's how you get access to all the resources, links, any of the tools Jim and Jeff mentioned in the follow-up email if you subscribe. And definitely a reminder, check out Identity at the Center podcast. I listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts sometimes, but you have the episodes on YouTube too, right?
Yeah, we're everywhere.
Yeah.
Whether it's fortunate or unfortunate for the listener or the viewer. Yes, we're everywhere.
300, soon to be 390 episodes of real conversations with identity practitioners, vendors, and the people building the future of IAM. You can find them at idacpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. On the next episode of Continuous Identity Sessions, a little tease, we're talking with Atul Shibegwali and Scott Kriz about how identity teams can secure AI agents. So this is a great little appetizer. If you've ever wondered how to secure something that's not quite a user, not quite a service account, and definitely not going to sit through security training, you'll want to join us. Until then, keep making identity work better. We'll see you next time. I'm Dustin Avall for Continuous Identity Sessions. Thanks, guys.